Happy Father's Day. How many dads do we have in the audience here? Stand up. Make yourself known. Come on. All right. So, have you bought your dad a gift already? Some of you, it's caught you by surprise because Father's Day has come early in the month. It's the third Sunday, but when it lands on the 15th, it catches you by surprise because you think it should be next Sunday. But it's this Sunday. And in case you forgot about it, I have some suggestions of some great, unique gifts that you can buy Dad that will actually make him happier than buying him that, the tie or the socks or whatever you usually get for him, okay? So the first thing I want to show you is it's a retro hot dog and bun toaster. This will immediately transport your dad to the P&E or to the park or the play, where he doesn't have to spend another dime on anything. Your dad probably doesn't like spending all that kind of money. So, plus if he's babysitting the younger kids or like me, your grandchildren, it's a great way to prepare lunch because in about 2 or 3 minutes, you got lunch ready. You just put the 2 buns in there, 2 hot dogs in there. You got lunch already made. Great thing. Get it on Amazon. Now, does your dad come home from work stressed out sometimes? Like it's bad, a rough day at work, too many meetings, too many things that didn't go right, things kind of taking a downturn. And he just wants to scream, just wants to yell. But of course, being an Asian dad, he has to be very reserved and not give expression to that. So this is a great way for him to give vent to all those feelings because with a push of a button, these goats will squeal for him. And I'll relieve all his stress and all his tiredness all in one little push button. Now, speaking of stressed out, any dads here with daughters? Come on. Oh, this is for you. This is definitely for you. Anybody else here with daughters? Yes? Okay, I got just the shirt for you. Especially when your daughter starts approaching dating age, which for her is probably at least 1 or 2 years, if not 5 years, less than what you think it is. Okay, so this is the shirt that you need to start wearing around her friends and around any guy that might want to date her. Okay, you got to wear this shirt all the time. It's dads. It says dads against daughters dating. In the small print it says shoot the first one. The word gets around. It'll put an end to her social life. She will have some problems with you, but you'll be able to work them out over time. Do Chinese dads tell dad jokes? No? Is that just a dumb Caucasian kind of thing? I like telling dad jokes. So you can introduce your dad to telling dad jokes by buying him this book. It has 1 dad joke per day. Have you heard dad jokes? I might have to explain some of these to you because I know in the past I've had to explain some of you or tell you when you can laugh or not laugh. What kind of bed does a whale sleep in? A waterbed, all right. It's a teacher. I got a couple of those here. I just got to try these out. We're Canadian, so we have moose. What do you call a moose without a name? It's an anonymous moose. Anonymous moose? Anonymous. See, that's what you're supposed to do when dads tell jokes. You groan, you just kind of let out just a groan. We have lots of bears in NBC, right? We have brown bears, black bears, grizzly bears. What do you call a toothless bear? It's a gummy bear. There you go. You're getting the hang of it. You're getting the hang of it. Well, let me tell you one more. Where does a dad keep his dad jokes? It's in a database. So, if you get your dad telling dad jokes, which would be great fun for him, maybe not for you, you also need to buy him a bottle of Dadville, which he can give out to family and friends as he tells jokes because it relieves kind of the pain and the groans and all that go with telling dad jokes. Well, today's Father's Day, And really, what we just talked about has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk, very little to do with what I'm going to talk about. Maybe some. But I thought today we needed to recognize dads. You know, on Mother's Day, we recognize moms. We take them out for lunch and we celebrate them, and so we should. On Father's Day, we take dads out for lunch too, but he gets to pick up the bill. Now, I also want to acknowledge that while we want to celebrate dads and what it means for them to be a dad, we also want to acknowledge that for some of the days, not that great. You may not have had a positive experience growing up with your dad. And it can be a very painful time because that kind of brings it all to fore. We want you to know that we feel for you and struggle with that with you. One of the things I realized early into my life as a dad is because God showed it to me very clearly to me how I related to him as my father was directly related to how I related to my dad. My dad, I never doubted his love for me. Dad would have stopped a bullet for me. I knew that. He was a good provider. He was a good protector. But probably in my years where I might have needed him around most as I approached my teens, he was in many ways an absentee father. He was field director of a very big of a mission, and he was traveled a lot. He was out of the home quite a bit, and so he wasn't always around. And often when he was around, he was in his office and he was preparing things, sermons or whatever he had to do. And the office door was closed. And I knew when his dad's office door was closed, that I needed to respect his space because he was about really doing some really important, busy stuff. What I realized years later was I had superimposed that image on God as my father. Never doubted God's love for me. But it was difficult. I knew that often it felt like his office door was closed because he was going about much more important things in my little trivial life. And I had to learn to realize that God as my father wasn't like my father, my earthly father. But rather, when I think of God as my father, he begins to be the model for me to how to be a father to my children. And I learned how to be a dad through my kids. I had a prodigal son. I learned the parable of the prodigal son backwards and forwards in my own life. And I learned how it was very different. And so to you dads, let me say, we all have our imperfections. We have our flaws and failures, and most often we know those better than anybody else. But we always have to keep in mind that we are often inadvertently modeling for our children what it means to relate to God as their father. And that's an important thing to remember. But let me just kind of segue here into our sermon topic by asking you this question, in particular dads, is to say, what are your greatest fears as a dad? Now I know, as men we're not supposed to be afraid of anything. We're supposed to be stoic, we're supposed to be brave, courageous, stuff like that. But if we're ruthlessly honest, deep down inside we have fears. We fear for the safety of our children sometimes. We fear for the kind of world that they're going to grow up in. In my early years, I feared missing out on different things. You know, those first words. I'd be maybe on the job someplace, and I'd come home and Diana would tell me, you know, Jonathan just said this. Or his first steps he would take when he starts walking. Or the first time he has the laugh, and no, it isn't a bunch of gas in his stomach, and it's actually smiling, and he's actually laughing. But we also often miss out on the important milestones and experiences and the events in our children's lives. Missing out on some of their everyday lives, but not just that. Missing out on some of the important things because the reality of our lives is often we're very busy. And work has a habit of taking over. And unless we intentionally set up those boundaries in our lives to say, this is what I'll give to the job and this is what I need for my home life, our jobs will take over and we become slaves to whoever's paying our wages if we're not careful. there are always so many demands that come up, aren't there? And at times it's difficult to know what the best choice is to make in the moment. What is the opportunity we should, the door that we should be walking through? Through a lot of my years, I drove bus. I drove city bus, and I was home in the evenings. But when we were living in Saskatchewan, I loved tour and charter bus. And I would get out on the highway, and I'd be gone for like 2 or 3 weeks at a time. It's difficult to be part of your children's life when you're absent. When I became a pastor, I decided that I needed to make them a priority in my life. And my daughter particularly played high school volleyball. And I would always get her schedule, and I would write her games into my schedule. And I would never take another appointment. If somebody asked if they could see me on that day, I'd say, no, I already have something. Didn't feel like I was obligated to tell you what I had, but I had something that was really important. And I made a point of being at all her volleyball games, just showing up sometimes. But in our time, there's a different kind of fear of missing out that's around. Or you perhaps have heard about it, FOMO, as it's now referred to. And it's taken on a whole new and different meaning, and it's now become recognized and diagnosed as a social anxiety disorder that can seriously affect your mental and emotional health. Simply put, it's the fear of missing out on something better that might be going on, something better than what you're experiencing, that the idea that someplace along the way, your friends and people that you know are enjoying a better life than you are having more fun doing something than you are. And perhaps even more depressing and anxiety causing is that there are events that you just didn't know about because you weren't well up to date on things, or worse yet, you weren't even invited to. And so FOMO ends up creating these feelings of being left out. It has the potential also to freeze us in our ability to make the critical decisions in our lives. Because we get caught up in thinking, if we were to choose this job, because this job, well, maybe there's a better one that's going to come open, but because I chose this one, I can't go to this one. Choosing who you're going to date and eventually marry. You can think, well, maybe somebody better come along. And guess what? That person is probably thinking the same thing about you. Choosing to go travel to a different place. And you think, well, maybe a better deal will come up. We miss out on something or someone better that could come up while we're otherwise distracted and occupied, and we get frozen in our decision making because we're thinking that something better is going to happen out there. It's fear of missing out. And the end result is we can develop a low sense of self-esteem, poor self-image. We end up spending money we don't really have to buy things we really don't need in order to fit in with the crowd, in order to feel like we belong. And sometimes we're spending money that we don't have to be able to enjoy, quote, the good times that we can post up on our Facebook page just like anybody else and tell them how much fun we're having when we're really not. See, one of the greatest forms of spreading FOMO is actually social media. And for that reason, it often affects those who are under the age of 35 a whole lot more than those who are older, because they spend so much time on social media and allow it to determine how they look at their lives. But on social media, we're really reading the highlight of other people's lives, and we compare them to the mediocrity of our average everyday life, thinking that's what they live. They live like that all the time. And we come up wanting and wishing for something more than what we are experiencing. Like I said, it's probably why it affects those who are younger in a greater level than us. You realize 92% of all Canadians are on some form of social media. In fact, on an average, we spend almost 2 hours a day on social media. More than that is we spend close to 7 hours a day on an average, and somebody must be averaging a whole lot more than that because I don't. 7 hours a day on the internet, which, by the way, means that if you're in your middle teens and you're just kind of starting out in your adult life, by the time you get to my age, you will have spent close to 15 years of your time on the internet and on social media. Is that good expenditure of time? we spend a lot of time on those things, and it begins to influence how we think. See, the reality is, for most of us, and for most of you probably, that your phone rules your life. And if you don't believe me, I challenge you to turn it off for 24 hours. Not turn the ringer off, because then you can check it once in a while, but turn it off. Give it to somebody else to say, hold on to this until I ask for you in 24 hours. I'm venturing that very few of us, if any of us, would actually do that, be able to do that. I'd like to hear from you if you take me up on that, by the way. But my purpose today isn't to speak against the use of cell phones nor the internet or even social media, but rather to challenge you and me to exercise greater discipline in how we use our digital devices and the amount of time that we spend on them and how we allow it to influence. Just for a minute, let me speak to you from my heart as your pastor. Here's my fear, if I have one as your pastor. My fear is that your FOMO, your fear of missing out on all this world has to offer, will cause you to miss out on what God is offering you. Let me repeat that again. See, my fear is that you get so caught up in your fear of missing out, and you're spending so much time trying not to miss out on all these different things that the world has to offer you, that you are missing out on the very thing that will actually give you a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in life, which is what God is offering you. See, FOMO is ultimately a very self-centered and based on satisfying some real needs, okay, real needs that we have, but in a very selfish way. And it will keep us from stepping out in faith and walking through the open doors that have even greater opportunity to make a difference in this world. John Ortberg, in his book, All the Places to Go, puts it this way. He says, the real deep reason that FOMO exists is that we were made for something more. And we are missing out. Only the more isn't more money or more success or more impressive experiences that I can write about on Facebook. My hunger for more, he writes, turns out to be insatiable and never satisfied if I try to satisfy by wanting more for me. So what if? What if we were created for more than what we're experiencing right now? What if the more we so much want to experience and crave is not found anywhere where we are now looking for it? You see, we, that is you and I, were created for more. Just not the way we measure more. Well, Jesus arrived on the scene to tell us that about the life that we're missing out on. And this is what he had to say. He says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. But notice, he didn't say that we might have an abundance in life, but that we might have life in abundance. Very different, an abundant life. Not that we would have a life full of all the good things that we want and we so much think we need, but that we would have a fulfilling life that was full of meaning and significance. Now, he also said that part of our problem is that there is a thief out there who seeks to steal that life from us by deceiving and misleading us, and destroy us by misleading us into thinking that what the more is that we so much crave in life is something different than what God offers through Jesus. And that's why when we looked at Paul and what he tells us in Romans 12:2, he says, don't allow this world to squeeze you into its mold, to squeeze you into its way of thinking and the way of living, but rather allow God to do his transforming work in you so you begin to think differently and develop a different perspective on life, and you see your own life and the world around you from a different point of view. Now, Paul gives us some further advice along the way as to what that means and how we live our everyday lives. And we're going to look at the text that was read for us earlier from his letter to the followers of Jesus living in the city of Ephesus. The city of Ephesus was a very important city. It was the fourth largest city in the Roman Empire at the time. It was on a trade route. It was kind of like had everything that you could want there and purchase there. Well, we're partway through a sermon series that we have entitled Being People of the Door, Open Door. Becoming people of the open door. Followers of Jesus who are ready and willing to walk through the doors that open before us every day of our lives. We talked about what it means to be a church of the open door, but we cannot be a church of the open door if we ourselves as individuals aren't people of the open door ourselves, because we bring who we are to church and our church becomes who we are. So we can't be something different out there and pretend to be something different in here and think that God's going to work through that. It doesn't work that way. Now, some of the doors in our everyday lives may seem insignificant, but they do have the potential to affect not only our lives, but the lives of others in ways that we may never fully realize or even discover, learn about. But others of those doors will open our way into a life that is radically different beyond anything that we could imagine for ourselves at the beginning point. The thing is, we simply do not know what is on the other side of that door until we walk through it. And that, of course, is part of the problem walking through that door, isn't it? There are, among the things that keep us from walking through the doors are a certain amount of fears. Fear of the unknown. Fear of getting it wrong. Made the wrong decision. A fear of failure. Maybe it takes me into something I simply can't accomplish. But I suspect that one of the biggest fears that we have that keeps us on this side of the open door is a fear of missing out on something better or giving up something better that we can have on this side than what God will provide us on the other side. Sometimes we develop this caricature of God. And I say, if you think this way, stop and think a little bit more about what this says about how you think about God. That God is going to call me to do something I don't like, go someplace where I don't want to be, and just ruin my whole life. Or maybe the lives of my kids. I had connection with another parent years ago whose daughter was dating a young man who wanted to be a pilot for MAF. And she was just hoping that it would not work out. Why? She didn't want her daughter to have to go to some place around the world and be out of reach from her and be in a different place where it would be rough and hard life. We have fear of our kids missing out, and that way we don't release them to follow God's leading in their lives. Shame on us if that's what we do. Because we not only hold them back, but we hold the work of God back in the world. But again, back to us. Sometimes we are holding on too tightly to what we already have, and we figure what we already have is going to be better than what God can give to us if we walk through that door, if we risk it all and step out in faith and go through that door. So look at what Paul has to say in these verses. And he begins by saying, and be very careful. Be very careful in how you live. Watch out. Watch your step. Paul's favorite metaphor for what it means to be living is the idea of walking. And I like that because it's progressive. It moves. And we learn to walk by faith. How? The same way, have you ever watched a toddler learn how to walk? It's amusing until they actually fall down and hurt themselves. And then, of course, it's no longer amusing. But they stumble. Walking. You know what walking is? Walking is simply controlled falling. Because in order to walk, you have to put yourself off balance. If you seek to keep balance in life, you'll never move. That's why I say stability, security, and safety. Great priorities to have, great values to have, but if they trump every decision you make, you'll never walk through any open door that God gives you. Because to follow Jesus through that door into the unknown is to venture into what may not be safe, may not be as secure as you want it to be, and definitely won't be as necessarily totally stable either. But living on the edge, if you're aren't living on the edge, I would say you're taking up way too much space. I'll show you a picture later on in our family chat that shows what I think. That's to get you to stay. Be very careful then how you live, how you walk. Watch your step. Actually, brings to mind my backyard, because we have a couple of dogs. Actually, I should say my daughter and husband have a couple of dogs. And if they haven't been cleaned up very lately, you got to watch where you step, because you might step into it. You know what it is. You just have to add a couple more letters and you find out. But it is not a pleasant experience to step into. And sometimes life is like that. If we don't watch where we step into it. Now, this is the 5th time in a very short space since the beginning of chapter 4 that Paul has now been warning them or exhorting them about how they live. It begins back in chapter 4 and verse 1 where he says, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you have received. We've all been called to follow Jesus. And he's saying, live a life worthy of that calling. He goes on to say in verse 17, and he says, I tell you this, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles, doing the futility of their thinking. In other words, here's another way of saying, don't let the world that you used to kind of shape your life, let it continue shaping your life. If you're a follower of Jesus, you now need to let God shape your life by transforming the way you think, by not staying in the futility of that thinking that was there, that seemed to rewarding, but really is empty and hollow and leads to nowhere. Chapter 5, verse 2, he says, live a life of love, just as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. Love is the very essence of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He said, well, it's love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. And that is with all your life, with every aspect of your being. And then he would have surprised and shocked people by saying, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he equated it with loving God, because if you don't love your neighbor, it reflects on the lack of love that you have for God. What Jesus was saying is, if love is the guiding principle in your life, if you're living a life of love just as Christ loved us, you don't have to worry about all the other commandments. You don't have to worry about all these other things, because you will fulfill them just by living a life of love. That's where it's at, Jesus said. Live a life of love. You know, we end up with a lot of rules and regulations and policies, and those who know of me in the administrative state probably find me a hard person to work at. I hate rules, okay? Rules to me were meant to be bent as far as you can before you break them. Because here's the thing that I find out when we have rules, and we end up with rules to enforce rules. We eventually begin serving the rules and the policies that we come up with rather than serving us. If we simply come back to living a life of love, honestly, we don't need half of all the rules and regulations that we have. Live a life of love. Verse 8 in chapter 5. He begins by saying, being imitators of God, live as children of light, and find out what pleases the Lord. And then we get to 17 here, and for the 5th time he says, and he's kind of wrapping up and he's bringing a conclusion, because he said, be very careful. That in other words, in view of all these other things I've said to you about how to live, he says, now be very careful how you live. And then he goes on to qualify that in 3 different ways. I'm going to spend just a little bit, most of our time here focusing on the first way, and then just summarize the other 2, because I think the first one fits most adequately and most appropriately with our theme, which is about the open door. So he says, live not as unwise, but as wise. And then he's going to apply that, and we're going to look at that. But both the Jews and the Greeks had valued wisdom greatly. Now, if you go into a Jewish understanding and perception, the wise, and here Paul contrasts it with the unwise, but in the Bible it contrasts the wise with the fool. Now, we think of fools in kind of a very low-key kind of way, and it does dumb things. But when you come across the word fool in the Bible, it is, as David puts it in Psalm 14, the fool said in his heart, there is no God. So when the Bible contrasts the wise with the fool, it's contrasting the person who is committed to following God's ways for his life to the fool who says God doesn't exist and I don't need to pay any attention to him. Now this thought has come to me, and I'm just going to share it with you. And it's not that I'm not saying that this is who you are. It's at times been probably who I am. And what I've discovered as Christians, if I can use that term liberally, we can be professing theists. We believe in God, and we gather together for worship, and we gather here, we give part, we serve in different ways. But when we get out into our own personal lives, we are actually practicing atheists or agnostics at best, because we live the rest of our lives as though God doesn't have an invested interest in it. We give our percentage of whatever it is, and maybe 10%, whatever you give, maybe give generously to the work, God's work, or to charity. And then you figure that the rest is mine to spend the way I want. Talked about this now recently, and God says he expects 100% from you. That he has an invested interest in how you spend the rest. How you use the rest of your time. How you consult, how you experience God at work in your life. And we looked at it in Romans 12, 1-2, when we were talking about how will I know which door to go through. It isn't by coming up to the door and saying, oh, now I got to figure this one out. It's how you live every day of your life. And Paul in Romans says, present your life, your everyday life before God as an offering before him. Just give it to him right at the beginning of the day. Choose not to be conformed to the patterns of the world. It's a choice, conscious, intentional choice we make. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind, he says. But that's what God does in us as we choose to do these first two things. Sometimes we just want God to zap us. Take that away. Make me this new person. And he says, I will. But you have to choose this. And then Paul says, and then you will know and approve God's good and pleasing will. You see, we got to do this first before we can know this. And when we do this first, knowing and actually living it out just becomes natural and automatic in our lives because it becomes who we are. Paul goes on here to say, okay, so live not as unwise but as wise. And here's the key statement that I want to focus in on here before we shut things down here. Making the most, in the NIV it says, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. Now, you may have heard this expression before, but this is exactly where it comes from. Have you heard the expression, redeeming the time? Sometimes it's thrown about and I'm redeeming the time. Well, quite literally, when Paul is saying, make the most of every opportunity, he's using that exact term. If you translate it literally, it would see ransoming or redeeming the time. Now, the Greeks in our Bibles have two words for time. And they're both translated time, and so we can lose in some of the sense of meaning here. And those of you, which is most of you, speak two languages, understand that sometimes a direct translation doesn't convey the full meaning of the word that is being translated. And so the Greeks had one word for time called chronos, out of which we get chronological time. And it was measurable time in hours and minutes and hours, days, weeks, years, months, whatever. It's measurable time. And then they had another word for time called kairos, which was opportune time. It was the right opportune time to do something. And it was not necessarily tied to chronological time. And so when Paul says, when the fullness of time came, he says, in the fullness of opportune time came, Christ died for us. While we were still powerless, Christ died for us. Yet he came to earth in chronological time. At the right time, and that's chronological time when Paul was talking about that, Jesus came born of a woman to live among us. When Paul is talking here to redeem the time, it gives you a sense that you have to buy back the time, doesn't it? And that's because our lives are so filled with a whole lot of other stuff. What it conveys is to take advantage of the opportunity that's presented before us. If we were to make the most of every opportunity that's presented before us, it's going to cost us something in our own agendas. The truth is, again, let's be honest with ourselves. Not asking you to do open confession with each other right now. Just be honest with yourself and God here. That our lives are filled with so much busyness. We have no margin in life. That it costs us way too much, and we often actually don't even see the opportunity. We don't often discern the opportunity because we're too caught up in our own agendas to discern the opportunity that is present before us. And at best, it becomes an interruption in the things that we want to do with our day. And at worst, it becomes a total detour to where we want to go and what we want to do. Well, Paul says, the days are evil. What he means is the days are in a world that doesn't acknowledge or recognize God's presence and who he is. That's why you need to be wise and not unwise, not be a fool in how you lead your life. Because it's only as wise as somebody who is understanding that God is at work around us, even though sometimes in ways that we don't see, that will open our eyes, or begin to open our eyes and open our will to become part of what he's already doing in the world around us. He goes on to say, therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is. We've talked about that. I just want to step back here for a minute. Opportune time, making the most opportunity. Let me talk to dads again here for a minute, but I think this applies to parents and all of us in some way or another. Let me talk about the myth of quality time. Over the years, in some of my counseling and some of my relationships that I've had with different people, I've heard this, and if you believe it, it's actually a lie. I don't have quantity time to spend with my children, but it's quality time. Let me say right now that if you believe that, you're self-deceived. Because quality time, opportune time, grows out of quantity time. It's about being present, because opportune time can't be scheduled. We can schedule things that we do with our kids, and sometimes they turn into quality events and stuff like that. That's great. One of the things I learned this a little late. I was a little late in learning it all the way through. Once I learned, I started practicing it. That I needed to be present in my children's lives. My daughter played volleyball through her junior years in high school. And like I said, I made a point of being at her games. I also made a point of being available to drive her and other friends to games that were played at other schools. Now I have to say, there are often where I'm thinking, I want to say, hello, there's a dad sitting here, because the conversations that were going back and forth back there, it was like too much information. I just don't really want to know all that. But I also found that after we dropped her friends off and we would drive home, maybe only a 10 or 15 minute ride home, sometimes, not all the time, we could have maybe a 2 or 3, maybe 5-minute conversation that had some depth to it, where there was actually an issue where she said, oh, Dad, what do you think of this? But if I had not there present over the quantity time, I would have never experienced that as either. Opportune time comes unscheduled. And it doesn't have to be just with our children. It can be in the lives of others. It comes discerning where God is at work in somebody's life and God's saying, go talk to that person. They just need a little bit of encouragement. And it's the setting aside and saying, okay, I won't be able to do this. I won't be able to get to the store to do this kind of shopping. I won't be able to do this because this is more important. This is an open door that God has put in front of me. And I have an opportunity here. And I want to make the most out of that opportunity. I need to close it down. There's so much more that is here. But I want to bring it back to the question, are you missing out? I suspect most of us are in some way missing out on what God has for us because of the fear of missing out on other things that are taking place in our lives does not allow us to make room for that or space for that. I'm hoping that we become a church of the open door. I hope that's the direction that we're going. But we cannot be a church of the open door unless we become people of the open door. Because who we are becomes contagious with others. And when we begin to experience those things, you won't want to experience life any differently than that. So much of what God is doing centers on just this, being open to making the most of every opportunity. It may not lead to a big thing, and then again it might. And maybe you will never know the results of that. I'll share one more personal story, and then we'll close it down here. I think I might have shared part of this at different times, but at a time when our marriage was basically on the rocks. We had been married about 2 or 3 years. And it wasn't like there were other people in our lives. I just simply reached a point where I don't think I want to be married anymore. And we decided 1 year to take separate vacations. And Diana went off to Hawaii with her sister, and I went home to Ecuador to see my parents and my brother in Colombia. I wasn't walking with the Lord. I know God was part of my life, and when I look back, but I certainly didn't acknowledge His presence. And I got on this plane in Vancouver, and I was headed to Toronto, where I had to overnight and then catch a flight the next day to get to Miami and then to Ecuador. And you know how it is. You got 3 seats, and I like window seat because I like looking out. Can't see nothing, but you like looking out. And I hope nobody sits in the middle seat, right? I need my own space. I am painfully introverted. I act out a personality to do what I do here. And sure enough, man plunked himself down in the middle of the seat. And where's he at? He wanted to talk. And I had no interest. I was downright rude to him. And then it turns out he's a youth evangelist. I think of all the dumb luck. I get to sit beside a religious holy roller here. And I let him know I was not interested. As far as I know, I wasn't sure God even existed. And the plane had a stopover in Winnipeg, and he had to get off. So before he got off, he says, "Hey, it's Don." He says, "I have a book I'd like to give you if you promise to read it." My wife knows I never turn down a free book. So I'm thinking, I got a night to spend there. Yeah, sure, I'll read it. And I looked at the book when I was in Toronto, and it didn't connect with me, and I just put away. And I don't throw anything away, and that's a bad thing right now, especially when you're trying to move. A couple years later, this is kind of fast forward here, where I was going through a spiritual restlessness. And I thought, darn if I don't remember I had that book. I wonder what it was all about. I pulled the book out. It was a book by a Christian philosopher called Os Guinness. And the book was called In Two Minds, Undoubting. I opened up and I read, and the book was instrumental for leading me back to, going back to, particularly to the book of Romans, and eventually kind of finding my way back. Somebody sat beside me on a plane. Walked through an open door. And I'm here in large part because of that. You have the opportunity to be that in somebody else's life. I met up with him years later. Turned out he was Terry Winters, and some of you go back long enough to remember a guy by Terry Winters. In fact, I had the opportunity to be part of one of his events. And I actually met him at a fundraiser meal. And I walked up to him and said, you probably don't remember me. To which he said, on a plane from Vancouver to Winnipeg. And I thought, wow, I must have been rude. For he remembered, you either remember people who made a positive impression on you or a real negative one. And I'm sure I didn't make a positive impression. But in spite of that, he showed me love. Make the most of every opportunity. Again, my fear as a pastor is that we as a church get caught up in a lot of business, church work. You as individual people get caught up in your lives. And your FOMO, your fear of missing out on what the world has to offer will cause us to miss out on the very thing that God wants to do in and through our lives that will bring us the greatest sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. Worship team, would you come close?